Hello gardening friends, and welcome to my grandmother's kitchen at Armstrong Acres. I have been wanting to do a tomato video for a while, and today is the day. It seems like there are a lot of new growers out there, those who have discovered gardening since COVID, and the first thing that any new gardener wants to plant and grow is tomatoes, right? Unfortunately, they're not the easiest things in the world to grow, but we can work around that. And so I wanted to do this video to kind of talk about the very basics. So if you have been growing tomatoes for more than 3 years, you've probably figured all of this stuff out. If you are new to tomato growing, then this is the video that I wish I had thought to watch years ago when I first started growing tomatoes and had no clue. So let's just get into it. We're going to talk about the kinds of tomatoes. We're going to talk about how to plant them, how to care for them. We're going to talk about how to pick out good ones from the nursery. We are not going to talk about starting tomatoes from seed. And the reason for that is not a beginner topic, all right? I highly recommend that you master the art of growing tomatoes successfully before you start thinking about starting them from seed, okay? Most beginner gardeners just want a basic tomato, right? And so you can go to the big box stores, you can go to your local nurseries, and you can find a basic tomato plant. It is a slippery slope. Once you've started growing them and tasting them and falling in love with all of the different varieties, you may, like me, decide that the big box varieties aren't good enough anymore and you want to branch out. And that's when you really have to start growing from seed, because you're not going to find these varieties anywhere else. But that's for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, okay? When I first started growing tomatoes, I had no idea that there were different kinds, there were different sizes, there were different leaf types, there were different colors. I just thought there were red tomatoes. And I didn't have a lot of success, but I got better at it. And last year, crazy me planted 85 tomatoes. They were all different kinds, all different colors, all different shapes, and I still have a freezer full of tomatoes that need to be processed, because just as they were really coming on at the height in September, I got called to work full time, which put a damper on my processing. So, things to think about, right? Are you going to have time when these tomatoes come in to process them, or are you growing them just because you want to have fresh tomatoes? All questions you need to know the answers to before you start growing. All right, so let's talk about the basics, right? There are 3 different types of tomatoes that you will encounter. The first type are called indeterminates, and these are the vast majority of tomato varieties are indeterminates, and that means that you put them in the ground and they grow and grow and grow and grow and produce and produce and produce until frost comes and kills them, okay? Because they're growing for such a long time, they get really tall. It's not uncommon for 6 or 8 or 10 feet tall indeterminate tomatoes, right? So that's a consideration. If you don't have room for them, then you don't want to grow indeterminates. The second most common would be determinants. And these are the tomatoes that a lot of canners really like, because they stay smaller, usually about 5 feet, sometimes smaller. And what they do is they grow and they reach their maximum height, and then they produce all of their fruits within a couple of weeks, okay? So that's great for canners because you want all of the tomatoes at the same time, right? Not so great if you want a nice sandwich from July into October, okay? Because that's not going to happen with these determinants. They are going to put on their fruits, like I said, most people will say all at the same time, but it's over a couple of week period. And then they poop out. They're done. The third type of tomatoes are not that easy to find. They are called dwarf tomatoes, and they are a relatively new type of tomatoes. Now, you might find some dwarfs as termed patio tomatoes, and they usually grow really, really tiny tomatoes, right? But there are dwarf tomato plants, and by dwarf we mean about 3 feet tall, that will grow full-size tomatoes, all right? So it's an up-and-coming kind of thing in the tomato world. There's actually a group called the Dwarf Tomato Project that have been breeding these tomatoes for the past couple of years, and now the seeds are becoming available. And so I have never grown dwarf tomatoes before. This is the first year that I'm going to be trialing those. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so in addition to different growth habits, right, we've got the indeterminates that are really tall, we've got the determinants that are reasonably tall, and then we've got the dwarfs that are much shorter. We also have different types of leaves. So you might hear of somebody talking about a potato leaf tomato. What does that mean? Well, it means that the tomato plant, that variety, has a leaf that looks more like a potato than a tomato. And I'm going to show you some pictures here. This book was written by Craig LaHoulier, and he happens to be the man who is one of the brains behind the Dwarf Tomato Project. And so this book is great in a lot of ways. It talks about growing tomatoes and diseases and all that kind of stuff. But it also talks a lot about starting from seed, which again, I don't recommend for beginners. So check it out of the library, give it a read, don't get overwhelmed, all right? And then once you get more into growing tomatoes and all of the different varieties, this is probably a book that you're gonna wanna add to your own library. All right, so let's see. I forgot to mark the page. And I'm not going to be able to find it now. He had a beautiful picture of the different types of tomato leaves. Here we go. Okay. So this is the regular type of tomato leaf that you are probably most familiar with. Okay. This over here is the potato leaf. So you can see they're a little larger, and they look a lot like potato leaves. And then they're even, we have rugosa, which seem to be more crinkly, for lack of a better word. And some tomato varieties are wispy. They have wispy leaves. And so all of these are going to be types of leaves that you could see on your tomato plants. Does it really matter as far as what you're growing? No, it doesn't. It just helps to know what to expect from a variety. For instance, I grew a plant last year that had wispy foliage, and I was really concerned that the plant wasn't healthy until I realized, oh wait, this is a wispy kind of plant and this is normal. So just something to know about the tomatoes that you're planting. All right, so we've talked about growth habit, we talked about leaf shapes. Let's talk about sizes, because not only are there different sizes of plants, there's also different sizes of tomatoes. So those of you who like a good tomato sandwich know that you like the big, beefy slicing tomatoes, right? A lot of them are referred to as beefsteak type, even though beefsteak is its own variety, but there are a lot of other tomato varieties that are classified as beefsteak types because they're the big ones that make great sandwiches. There are also, they might be called slicers as well, and there are some smaller varieties that aren't so gigantic that are good for slicing as well. There's also smaller ones that are called plum tomatoes, and then grape tomatoes, because They're like the size of a grape. Cherry tomatoes, right? We're mostly familiar with those. And then there's some even smaller types, like the Mexican midgets. They're really, really tiny tomatoes. And so you want to know which type you're growing. Because if you are a lover of tomato sandwiches, you might not want to be growing plum tomatoes because they're going to be much smaller than you probably want for a sandwich. So just keep that in mind as well. The ones that I like to grow are the slicers and the cherries. I don't like the plum tomatoes because they're an awkward size for me. They're too big to throw in a salad without cutting. They're too small to like justify processing into sauce. So I just don't grow them a lot. You also might hear some referred to as saucing tomatoes. And those are the ones that don't have a lot of the goop inside, right? It's mostly meat. And that's what we're looking for when we want to make tomato sauce. We don't want a lot of that liquid water. So again, depends on what you want to do with tomatoes. I myself find that a lot of, for instance, Amish paste is a variety I grew for the first time last year. It's known as a paste tomato. It was great. It was great for eating alone. Okay, so a lot of them, can fill a couple of different types of purposes, but something to keep in mind. All right, you also want to keep in mind the days to maturity. Some tomatoes come on early. Some take 85 days to fruit, all right? And by 85 days, or some will say 50 days, those are the early ones, we mean not when the tomato was planted. We mean from the time that that tomato was put in the ground. And the reason for that is, in my personal experience, you could have a tomato transplant this big, or you could have a tomato transplant this big. If you put them in the ground at the same time, it's not going to be long until your little guy catches up with the big guy, all right? And it's amazing how quickly they just take off as soon as they get in the ground. And so something to think about as well is days to maturity, because if you are anxious for tomatoes, but you plant all of the late varieties, you're not going to have anything early in the season. So you might want to think about planting an early season, a mid-season, and then a late season so that you can have tomatoes earlier and later. All right, so those are the things to think about as far as tomatoes. Let's talk about the actual what you need to know in order to start growing. First of all, I'm going to assume, like I said, that you are all going to be purchasing your tomato transplants. So when you go to the store or the nursery, you want to be looking for a couple of things. First of all, we've talked about determinate and indeterminate. That should be clearly labeled on the plant so that you know, oh, if I buy this plant, I'm going to have to stake it because it could get 8 feet tall. Or this is a determinate, so if I buy it, I might be okay with those cheap little cone-shaped cages that are, I hate them. But anyway, they're okay for determinants. So you're at the nursery. What do you look for? Number one thing is you do not want tomato seedlings that are tall and leggy. If they look overgrown for the pot that they're in, if they look like they've been stretching for the light, you really don't want those. Leave them there. You do not want to bring home tomatoes that have already blossomed or flowered, or even have had fruits on them, right? They are going to suffer transplant shock much. They're not going to do nearly as well as the smaller tomato or the less mature tomato that doesn't have fruits or blossoms on them. You absolutely do not want to bring home any tomato that has yellow leaves, all right? That's just asking for problems. It could be nothing, all right? Tomato leaves do yellow, but usually it's on very mature plants that have been in the ground for a while and not on seedlings, all right? If the seedlings have yellow leaves, it usually means there's a disease and you don't want that. So leave the yellow leaves there. And then finally, it might be obvious, but you do not want to bring home plants that look wilted or sad, all right? You want to bring home healthy, robust plants. You want to make sure their stems look good and thick. The shorter and squattier, the better in this case, all right? Now, the nurseries will start putting out their tomato plants for sale way earlier than they should, all right? So what that means is, especially this year in 2021 with the pandemic and the gardening frenzy, as soon as you can buy those plants, buy them. Take them home, but do not plant them out in the yard, all right? The time to plant in the garden is when the nights are safely in the 50s. Tomatoes are heat-loving plants. They do not want to be cold. And if you plant them too soon, they're not going to die. Well, they may die if there's a frost and it goes below 32. But if the nights are consistently in the high 30s, low 40s, those plants are going to pout for you all season, and you just don't want that. So my recommendation is, as soon as you see the plants, buy them. Bring them home. If it's a nice, warm, sunny day, put them out. Let them enjoy the sunshine and the wind. That'll toughen them up. If it's going to fall below 40 or 50 degrees at night, bring them inside your garage, right? You don't have to even bring them in the house. Just put them in the garage. And then only when the soil is warm and the nights are in the 50s should you plant your tomatoes in the garden. All right. So you have your plants, you've brought them home, you've babysat them and kept them happy, and now it's time to put them in the soil, right? So tomatoes want soil between 6.2 and 6.8 pH level. If you've never had a soil test, I highly recommend that you get one because it will tell you, first of all, if you have to adjust your soil pH for your plants. And it'll also tell you if you are missing some of the key nutrients that tomatoes and other plants need, okay? Tomatoes also want good drainage. So if you don't have that, you might want to consider planting in raised beds or planting in containers. And they also want full sun. All right. If you don't have a full sun area, I would recommend trying to start out with cherry tomatoes because usually they do really well, first of all, no matter what. All right. I've never seen anyone kill a cherry tomato. They're very tough. So they're great. If you have never grown tomatoes or never grown a vegetable, start with cherry tomatoes because they're just very hardy and they will grow. Okay, they're the easiest type to grow. And in my experience, you can get away with a little less sun with them. Okay, so you know where you're growing them. You know now when to transplant them, right? Only when the nights are in the 50s. So let's talk about how to transplant them. For tomatoes and tomatoes only, all right, this does not count towards anything else that you will be planting in your garden. All right, so don't say, Lynette told me to plant deep and my plants died. Only tomatoes get planted deep. Now, what do I mean by that? It's the beginning of the season, so obviously I don't have a tomato plant. This is a dried lemongrass stalk, but I'm going to show you. All right, let's pretend that this is our tomato. It's a little taller maybe than the transplants that you'll bring home. So, all right, let's do that. All right, so here's your tomato. What you want to do is strip the leaves from here down. I usually leave about 2 sets of leaves at the top and I strip all the rest off. If you look really closely at your tomato stem, you're going to see little hairs. And each of those little hairs has the potential to develop into a root, right? And we want to encourage that because the stronger the root system, the stronger the plant. So if you've got 2 sets of leaves up here, I would plant it this deep, right? So this is all going to be in the soil. Now, many times it's almost impossible to dig an 8 or 9 inch hole. It would take forever. Sometimes soil is compacted, etc., etc. So what I usually do is I dig a trench, and I will gently bend the tomato like this, and then I will bury it. And so it's this part right here that's sticking out of the trench, and all of this is underneath waiting to grow roots. Okay? Now a tip for you. If you're growing more than a couple, all right, what I did is I made the trenches face the same direction. For instance, if I made it really easy to remember, and I dug the trenches so that this part was facing the house. So I knew when I went to water the tomato to concentrate on this side of the plant, right? Because if you've trenched a tomato like this and you water this side, you're not getting the most bang for your buck out of that water, right? So just a little hint is make them all face the same direction, and that will help you when it's time to water them. So I dig a trench, and then what I usually do is sprinkle some fertilizer in there. This is Biotome from Espoma. It's 433, so it's a very gentle fertilizer. The 4 is N, right, nitrogen, P, phosphorus, and then K, potassium. It's alphabetical order, right? NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Now, if you've gotten a soil test and you know that you're really low on phosphorus or potassium, you might want something with a little higher number. But that's for further on in the growing season, I think. To start out with, I recommend something. You want to have something that's going to help develop the roots, all right? But you also want something with nitrogen in it because that's going to help strong foliage at the beginning, all right? So I put my starter fertilizer in. I don't want to say pound. I press the soil down so it's got good coverage with the tomato, and then I water it in, all right? You want those plants to be well watered. Once the plant has grown a little, you want to mulch it. And the reason is there's a lot of enemies in our soil. Soil-borne diseases that can wreak havoc with our tomato plants. So if you mulch with shredded leaves or leaf clippings from mowing the lawn, it prevents splatter. And so hopefully your tomatoes will be healthier than if the soil was splattering up, every time it rained. Right? All right, once you've got your tomatoes in the ground, you need to start thinking about how you're going to stake them. If you are growing determinants or dwarfs, then the little cages that they sell in the big box stores are probably going to be okay for you. If you are growing indeterminates, then you're going to need something taller for staking. We in the past have used the 10-foot tall wooden, I think they're 1x1s. I don't know what they are, but we pound them in, and then I use this stuff in order to connect the plants. Right? If the pole was here and the plant was here, I would go like this, and I would Velcro. It's not easy to do with one hand. I would Velcro them like this. Now, you don't want it so tight that the stem can't move, all right? You definitely want to leave room. I've also tied it with twine. There are people who use elastic. You can attach, or you can use a multitude of things in order to stake your plants. But you definitely want to stake them, or else a windstorm will come in and destroy them. All right, the next important thing you need to know is pruning. So, pruning, rule number 1, you only want to prune indeterminate varieties. If you have determinants, don't even think about pruning them, or you will seriously reduce the number of tomatoes that result. If you have cherries, I don't bother pruning them. They produce like mad. Indeterminate tomatoes you need to prune. And what we mean by pruning is we mean that we're taking out the suckers. What's a sucker? All right, so let's pretend that I am the tomato stem, right? My head and my body is the tomato stem, the main stem. It's going to have branches that grow out like this, which is my arm, okay? And then in between the main stem and the branch, there's going to be a growth. Can you see that? I hope you can. Right here, usually at 45 degrees. It's coming out of the armpit of the plant, if you will, right? It's a terrible explanation, but as soon as you walk into a store and see a tomato plant, you're going to be able to say, oh, this is a sucker because it's growing out of the armpit. Those suckers will eventually produce their own stems and more suckers and fruits. But if you leave all of them on the tomato plant, you will be in for a mess, all right? So what I usually do is I cut off any suckers that are growing in the first 12 or 18 inches of the plant, right? There are people out there who say take off every sucker, and that's called a one stem or a main leader, pruning it to a main leader. I did that one year and had terrible luck, so I will never do a one stem pruning again. What I did last year worked really well is I let about 4 suckers develop, and then I cut all the rest off. Okay, and so that was a happy medium between opening the plant up to let lots of air flow in. That's another reason why we sucker, because the more air that gets around the leaves of the tomatoes, the healthier they're going to be. So it's up to you, and you can experiment all you want, okay? Whether you just let them go and don't prune them at all, or if you prune to 1 liter, it's up to you. But do not prune determinate or cherry tomatoes. The neat thing about the suckers that you cut off is that you can stick them in water and they will root. And then you can plant those and get a whole nother tomato plant. So if you are taking plants home from the nursery and you are stripping off the lower 2/3 and you have some suckers in there that you're stripping off, put those suckers in water and you will have more free plants. And who doesn't like free plants, right? Okay, so real quick, because I have about 1.5 minutes before my camera shuts off. Pests and diseases. So the number 1 pest that you're going to see around this area, South Central Massachusetts, is the tomato hornworm. And this is a picture from Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, a great book if you're interested in native plants and why to plant them. But this right here is a tomato hornworm. Well, minus the white things. We'll talk about those in a minute. Tomato hornworms can decimate your plants in a day. Usually you will not see them because they blend right in. Usually you'll see their poop, right? And you will notice that your tomato leaves are completely gone. So that's when you go hunting. And if you find a hornworm by itself, squish it. If it's got these white leaves on it, leave it, because those are wasp eggs and they're wonderful. All right, my camera's going to shut off here. If you have any more questions, email me. I'll put the address down below. Actually, maybe I won't. It's just armstrongacresma@gmail.com. hopefully this gave you some good hints about growing tomatoes. Stay tuned for more.